This is the Dollemore Daily.
Hi, I'm Mike Greiner from the Democratic Activist channel, which we'll link to down below. And I'm still sitting in for Jesse as he's finishing his move from California to D.C. I've been informed, by the way, that he still has not received his furniture in D.C. His move, of course, was disrupted by the snowstorm that occurred there. And I can tell you, having lived in D.C., that they are woefully unprepared to deal with snow the way we are here in Michigan. Nevertheless, the news never stops, and we have a big story to talk about today, so let's talk politics. And the big story that I'm talking about is that the Ohio Supreme Court yesterday ruled that a gerrymandered map that was put together that gave Republicans a huge advantage in the state elections was invalidated. Now, it's worth noting that this is just state legislative maps that have been affected by this ruling, not the congressional maps. Interestingly enough, there is another case going before the federal court that was put on stay while the Supreme Court kind of works out these different issues. Now remember, this is specifically the state Supreme Court in Ohio that made this ruling, and the ruling is specifically based on state law. So the U.S. Supreme Court, which of course we know is controlled by Trump Republicans, has no jurisdiction over this issue. Separately, the case that's in federal court right now does try to raise federal issues, namely the racial makeup of different districts, something that under the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was explicitly made illegal. However, as we know, the Trump Supreme Court has basically been taking the teeth out of the Voting Rights Act, necessitating Congress really to step in and do something about that. That's a matter for a separate video. But in this case, the Ohio Supreme Court specifically looked at the map based upon state law. And the state law that's at issue is a provision in the Ohio Constitution. Again, it's worth noting, not the U.S. Constitution, but the Ohio Constitution, that specifically says that a party may not draw legislative boundaries to favor one party over the other. This amendment was based upon a citizen ballot measure, which passed in November 2015 overwhelmingly with about 71% of the vote. Significant to note that this is in a state that's trending more and more Republican every year. And what this new provision in the Ohio Constitution does is it required the creation of a redistricting commission, a 7-member commission, which is responsible for redistricting the boundaries of the 99 House of Representatives districts and the 33 Senate districts in the state legislature. It's worthy of note that this amendment included some specific language that says, and I'm quoting from the language here, "The Ohio Redistricting Commission shall attempt to draw a general legislative district plan that meets all of the following standards." And A is, quote, "No general assembly district plan shall be drawn primarily to favor or disfavor a political party." And then B, "The statewide proportion of districts whose voters based on state and federal parties and general election results during the last 10 years favor each party shall correspond closely with the statewide preferences of the voters of Ohio." So what does that mean? Well, Ohio, as we know, is a state that was once seen as a bellwether, but more and more is trending Republican. That being said, Trump won the state with 54% of the vote. So in theory, about 54% of the legislature should be made up of Republicans, right? Well, as it turns out, the new districts that were drawn would give Republicans an edge of 62 to 37 in the House and 23 to 10 advantage in the Senate. So in other words, in the Senate, Republicans would have an advantage of almost 70%. While in the House, they'd have an advantage of 63%. This absolutely flies in the face of the desire of the Ohioans that the overall legislative makeup would more or less match how they voted statewide, which again is about 54% for Republicans. Interestingly enough, this was a 4-3 decision by the Ohio Supreme Court. And the 4 in the majority included, of course, the 3 Democrats on the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice, who's a Republican. Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor has been on the bench for 24 years, and she actually wrote the majority opinion. And while she certainly finds that the map that was proposed by this commission does not comply with the requirements of the Constitution, she also suggests that Ohio might want to adopt a more nonpartisan commission, something that does not include elected officials, such as exists currently in Arizona, California, Colorado, or my home state of Michigan. States which, by the way, have been praised for proposing fairer and less partisan maps than is typically seen coming out of the legislatures. I think that's a great comment by the Chief Justice. But what's more interesting to me are the ridiculous arguments raised by the minority in trying to defend this map. Let me give you a few examples. A big issue that they raise is that the Supreme Court does not have the ability to invalidate a plan under this amendment. The dissent says, the Constitution Amendment says that the court can order the commission to amend a General Assembly district plan or adopt a new one if the plan does not comply with the requirements of blah, blah, blah. According to the dissent, the majority then cannot say to the redistricting commission that this plan does not comply with the requirements of Section 6, you need to draw another plan, which to me seems pretty much on the line of saying that the commission needs to amend the plan or adopt a new one. But yet this is kind of the verbal gymnastics that we're seeing with the partisan MAGA crowd on these courts. Because of the fact that the commission was unable to reach a consensus, it actually adopted a plan for 4 years rather than the typical 10 years for a plan. And the minority is saying that as a result of the fact that it only adopted a plan for 4 years, then this plan should not be subject to review by the state Supreme Court, something that's explicitly required under the constitutional amendment. Now again, this strikes me very much like the kinds of efforts we've seen in Texas, for example, where they've tried to use different maneuvers to pass legislation that cannot be reviewed by the courts. And in fact, even the partisan MAGA U.S. Supreme Court has stated that these efforts by Texas to avoid judicial review do not comply with constitutional requirements. Finally, the minority accuses the majority of legislating from the bench, which is a particularly rich accusation after we've seen the U.S. Supreme Court, again dominated by MAGA Trump cronies, essentially rewriting the Voting Rights Act, which was reauthorized by a massive bipartisan majority less than 20 years ago. In fact, some of the news coverage pointed to the unusual acrimony that existed in the opinions and how the different justices made the kinds of comments that you typically don't see in more restrained judicial opinions. But most of this acrimony was coming from the right wing of the court. And it just shows how the MAGA crowd, when they don't get their way, they essentially throw temper tantrums. Now, unfortunately, this decision does not address issues with the congressional districts that were drawn. That map gives 80% of the state's 15 congressional districts to Republicans. Again, something that does not comport at all with the statewide vote. Unfortunately, the state constitutional amendment does not address congressional districts. And that challenge, which is before the federal court, of course, is the type of thing that would be overseen by the U.S. Supreme Court, which, as I talked about earlier, has really disfavored any kind of challenges under the Voting Rights Act. So where does this leave us? Well, the fact of the matter is, this is an incredibly positive development, both for democracy and for Democrats. It shows that there still are some Republicans who care about the law and democracy. It also shows that a fruitful approach for people concerned about democracy is to pass legislation by voter referendum. This is exactly what happened in Michigan and California, and in Ohio for that matter, where supermajorities passed legislation to limit gerrymandering, much to the displeasure of Republicans, who at least in Michigan and in Ohio controlled many of the levers of districting. Finally, it just shows the disturbing politicization of the courts that the MAGA crowd are engaging in. Thankfully, we had Justice O'Connor, who is willing to put country and the law before her partisan identity. Unfortunately, among the MAGA crowd, she's in the minority. And I can only assume that Republicans are going to be looking to take revenge on her in the next election. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me or have any questions about redistricting, I'd love to see your comments down below. And if you could check out my channel, Democratic Activist, we'll link to that down below as well. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.